Hey everybody, I'm Stuart. Look, whether you're an athlete, mathlete, chess player, or gamer, I'm sure a lot of us have heard the term playbook. It's the strategy a team plans in advance for how they want to play and hopefully win a game. Every play they'll run, every movement every player will make, every defensive strategy to stop the opponent, every strength of your team, every weakness of the other team, it's all a part of the playbook designed to help a team win. Could you go into a game without a playbook? Absolutely. But will you win? Maybe, but it definitely won't be as easy. That's why we're calling this series Playbook. No, I'm not gonna have you start running drills and calling plays to make you a group of super strength middle schoolers, although that might be cool. Instead, we're gonna spend the next 4 weeks developing a game plan to help us navigate one really big part of our lives, and that part is temptation. Temptation is a word that gets tossed around by adults and in places like church a lot, and usually in a negative way. When we hear the word temptation, maybe we think it's about something bad like saying bad words or stealing or cheating or maybe even things we do in secret. Those things aren't temptations. Those things are the result of giving into temptation. Temptation invites you to do something that may not be best for you, and how you respond matters. Maybe we can think about temptation this way. I think we all know what it feels like to be tempted toward things. The kinds of things we know will not work out for our good, things that are not best for you and me. It could be an app, a website, a person who's a bad influence, or even a place. And people who really care about you have warned you about it. And for some reason, you just want it more. So what do? Some of us distance ourselves from that person, place, or thing so we won't ever be tempted, or so the temptation is less or more difficult to give into. Others of us get as close to that person, place, or thing as we can, hoping we can experience whatever we think we want without horrible consequences. Still others of us, we just go for it. We completely give in to temptation, and for a time, there might not be any immediate consequences. In fact, you're listening to all of this and thinking, not me, that's not my experience. And so you begin to rationalize that this must not be that bad of a person, a place, or a thing to want, which only makes you want it more. Eventually, it's that kind of temptation that can potentially lead you down a path that isn't great. A path filled with consequences, punishment, maybe even guilt, stress, and more. And you find yourself wondering, why did I do that? And how did I get here? And what can I do to never end up here again? I found myself asking questions like this more than once. We all have before, and we probably all will again, because temptation is a lifelong thing. It's always gonna be there, and we're always gonna have to deal with it. Does that mean we have to stay powerless against it? Absolutely not. That's where a playbook, a game plan for navigating temptation, comes in. Now, this struggle to navigate temptation isn't new. According to what we read in Genesis, the first book of the Bible, the struggle to resist temptation is something humans have always dealt with. In Genesis, we learn that God had given Adam and Eve the freedom to do anything in the garden except one thing: eat the fruit from one specific tree. And you would think that with all that freedom, Adam and Eve wouldn't have even cared about the one thing they couldn't have. But that's not what happened. In Genesis, the author writes that Adam and Eve became convinced that God was actually keeping them from something good, that the fruit was really good for them, and they shouldn't trust what God told them. Adam and Eve chose to believe a lie. They chose not to trust God. They gave into the temptation to eat the fruit. That choice, well, it changed everything. That incident with Adam and Eve happened a long time ago in a garden, and you and I still struggle today in the same way. To trust that God really does have our best in mind. In fact, every person who has ever lived has struggled with temptation. We know this not just because we experience it ourselves, and we do, but because so many writers in the Bible talked about it too. James was one of those writers. After Jesus' resurrection, James, who was Jesus' brother, became the leader of the church in Jerusalem. James wrote to the followers of Jesus and others about issues that affected their everyday lives, including how to understand the temptations they might be experiencing. Let's take a look at one thing James wrote. When a person is tempted, they shouldn't say, "God is tempting me." God can't be tempted by evil, and he doesn't tempt anyone. But each person is tempted by their own evil desires. These desires lead them on and drag them away. When these desires are allowed to remain, they lead to sin. And when sin is allowed to remain and grow, it leads to death. Notice the very first word of these verses. James didn't say, if you are tempted. James said, when you are tempted. All of us are going to be tempted. Those are facts and part of being human. Temptation is a fact of life. But James says that God isn't the one who tempts you. Rather, the temptation comes from within us. It comes from a desire to be in charge of choosing what is right and what is wrong. We become convinced that God doesn't want something for us, but is withholding something from us. And the desire to do what we think is best, rather than what we know God says is best, it starts to grow. So if temptation is a fact of life and we're tempted by our own desires and not God, then doesn't it make sense that you and I learn to deal with those desires in a good and healthy way? Why? Because James said it best, there are consequences if we don't. Giving in to unhealthy temptations has the potential to hurt us. It can take us away from God's best for us. The longer we let temptation remain without dealing with it, the bigger it gets. And the bigger it gets, the harder it is to fight. Think of it like an avalanche. Every destructive avalanche starts with one snowflake. One snowflake can't really do any major damage, and it really isn't that big of a deal. But a snowflake becomes a snowfall that may even become a blizzard, and the amount of snow grows and grows and grows. And eventually, the buildup of snow is so heavy that it breaks away, is no longer controllable, and it starts taking out everything in its path. Temptation is like that avalanche. We might think that giving in here and there isn't that big of a deal. You may even be giving into temptation without any significant consequences. But if we don't control how we respond to temptation, it gets more difficult to resist. Every single one of us has given into some sort of temptation. And I think it's safe to say that most of us didn't plan to fall into temptation. No one decides, you know what? Today, I want to make such an unwise decision that it harms my relationship with God, my parents, and my friends. But here's the thing. Very few of us, if any, have a plan, a playbook for how we will resist temptation. And what is the first step in creating a playbook? It's believing that God sees things that we struggle to see and really wants what's best for us. When we choose to trust that, we're taking the first step in fighting temptation. We're writing the first play in our playbook to resist temptation. Here's why this matters. Temptation is something we'll face for the rest of our lives. In big and small ways, it's something we'll deal with a lot. Every day, we have the choice to either give in to the desires we know may not be best, or to trust God's good plan for our lives. And a game plan, a playbook, will help us make the choice to resist temptation and trust God every single time. Having a playbook for temptation will help you resist it. Think about some of the best players in sports: Simone Biles, Shohei Ohtani, Travis Kelce, Coco Gauff, LeBron James, Lionel Messi. These athletes don't show up on game day without a plan. They practice, they prepare, they study, and they do all of this long before the day of the actual event. Why? Because they know that a good playbook isn't something you can come up with on the spot. It's something that you have to think about ahead of time, before you're in the moment you need it. Temptation works the same way. We have to develop a game plan to fight it well before facing it. We can't decide how we're going to handle the temptation to cheat on a test, lie to our parents, or watch something on our phones at the moment we're tempted to do it. Instead, we have to come up with a game plan ahead of time, because having a playbook for temptation will help you resist it. While we're going to be developing a game plan over the course of the next 4 weeks together, let's start today by thinking about two things. Practice identifying what's tempting you. Think about last year. When did you make choices that weren't best for you? What tempted you to make those choices? Why did you want to do that thing you knew you shouldn't do? Popularity, being accepted, getting noticed, taking the easy way out, being curious. One of the first steps in resisting temptation is to identify what's making you want to do the thing you know may not be wise. Remember that God wants what's best for you. Just a few sentences after what we read from James today, he went on to write about how every good thing comes from God. Good is just who God is. Remembering the truth about who God is and what God wants for us is key to having a playbook for temptation. So think about how you can remember that this week. Maybe it's writing down the ways you've seen God come through in the past, or memorizing a few verses that speak to this truth, or talking with a parent, guardian, or trusted adult about how they focus on God's best. Whatever it is for you, choose to remember that God really does want what's best for you. Let that be the first play you run in your personal playbook to resist temptation. Having a playbook for temptation will help you resist it. Remember, you're not alone in this. All of us struggle with temptation. The great news is that you have a small group that cares about you and is committed to walking this road with you. Consider being honest with your group about your temptations and support each other. Together, commit to a game plan that helps you choose God's best. Now, when you head to your groups, ask yourself this question: what's one way you usually deal with temptation?